Winter in New York City, 2023. The cold air bit sharply, and the streets were slippery with leftover snow from an early storm. But I barely felt it. My mind was racing, making the world around me seem distant and muffled. I had flown in from Chicago, hoping to surprise Megan with an anniversary dinner, a chance to mend the growing cracks in our marriage. Yet, deep down, something had been gnawing at me for months, a quiet suspicion that only grew louder as time passed. Megan, my wife of 11 years, had been acting differently lately. At first, I blamed it on work stress, the long hours and tight deadlines. But then there were the subtle signs. She'd give me distracted glances when my name came up, spend late nights at the office, and take hushed phone calls whenever I wasn't around. I tried to push these thoughts away, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, we'd weathered plenty of storms together. But recently, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. The tipping point came when Megan casually mentioned that she and James, the new guy at work, had started collaborating on projects. Her tone was light and carefree, but my gut twisted. Why did she bring him up so eagerly? Why was she so keen to talk about this partnership? This man who had been a distant figure until now. James is a great guy, she had said, her smile bright but her eyes avoiding mine. We're working late this week, trying to get the presentation ready for that big client. It's been a grind. I didn't respond, but something shifted inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their partnership than she was letting on. That evening, as I sat in the back of a taxi heading to the hotel where Megan was staying, my mind kept churning. I'd already checked in, changed into a fresh shirt, and with the evening ahead of me, I wanted to make things right. A surprise dinner, a chance to reconnect and remind Megan of who we were before everything started slipping away. But as the cab weaved through the winding streets, a nagging doubt whispered in the back of my mind. Could we still make it work? Was it too late for us? The driver's voice pulled me from my thoughts. You look like you're on a mission tonight, my friend. Big night ahead. I managed a small smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Yeah, something like that. As we approached Megan's hotel, I checked my watch. 5:30 p.m. Perfect timing. I had just enough time to surprise her and make the evening special. I asked the driver to wait while I went inside to check on her. My nerves were on edge, but I pushed them aside. This had to work. Tonight had to be the night everything changed. Inside the hotel lobby, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. Trying to sound casual, though a hint of urgency crept into my voice, I said, "Hi, I'm Daniel Carter. I'm hoping to surprise my wife, Hannah Carter. Could you see if she's in her room?" The receptionist glanced down at her records and nodded. "Certainly, Mr. Carter. One moment, please." My heart raced as I stood there, eyes scanning the lobby, trying to calm my swirling thoughts. I was so close now, just a little longer. After a moment, the receptionist looked up apologetically. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's no answer from her room. Would you like to leave a message?" I tried to hide my disappointment, forcing a smile. "No, that's all right." I was hoping to catch her off guard. Leaning in slightly, I lowered my voice. "Tomorrow's our anniversary. I wanted to make it a special surprise." She returned my smile kindly. "Of course, Mr. Carter. I hope everything works out wonderfully for you." Thanking her, I stepped back into the lobby, a strange weight settling in my chest. Glancing at my watch again, it was 5:50 p.m. The evening wasn't unfolding the way I'd imagined. Stepping back outside into the crisp winter air, the city buzzed around me. It all felt so surreal. Everything about the city buzzed with life, vibrant, full of energy, yet inside, I felt like I was sinking. The evening I'd envisioned as a fresh start for Megan and me now seemed uncertain, like trying to hold water in my hands. Still, I pressed forward. The restaurant wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but my thoughts were scattered, darting miles away as I replayed our earlier conversation. Her words, her smile, or more accurately, the absence of that familiar warmth in her gaze, played over and over in my head. Something between us had shifted, and tonight, I was determined to uncover what. When I arrived, the restaurant was just as I'd imagined, a tucked-away little gem, small and intimate. The low lighting cast a warm glow over the space, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the air. I paused at the entrance, drawing in a deep breath to steady my nerves. This night had to go perfectly. Yet, as I stepped inside, doubt crept in like a shadow. Something felt off. The door swung shut behind me, and the cozy atmosphere wrapped around me like a blanket, though it did little to ease the unease in my chest. My footsteps echoed faintly on the polished floor as I scanned the room. The place felt like another world, a world where couples leaned in close, sharing quiet laughs and tender moments. But for me, it felt like my world was beginning to splinter. My heart pounded louder with each step. I glanced around, searching for Megan. She wasn't near the bar or by the windows. My eyes darted from table to table, hoping to catch sight of her. Then, as I moved toward the back of the restaurant, I heard it, a soft laugh, light and melodic. My stomach dropped. It was unmistakably hers. My breath caught in my throat, and I followed the sound, the need to confront her growing stronger with every step. The laughter grew louder, and then I saw them. Megan was sitting in a booth tucked into the far corner, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. She was close, too close, to a man I didn't recognize. Her posture was relaxed, her expression open, her eyes bright. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, and they were deep in conversation, completely absorbed in each other. It hit me like a punch to the gut. The way she smiled at him, it wasn't the smile of a woman thinking about her husband. It was the kind of smile she used to give me years ago, before life wore us down with compromises and struggles. My chest tightened as I stood there, frozen, watching as the man leaned in closer. And then she kissed him. Not a fleeting, casual kiss. No, it was soft, lingering, the kind of kiss that made the rest of the world disappear. For a moment, I couldn't move. The bustling restaurant seemed to fade, leaving me alone in a hollow, silent void. My mind scrambled to make sense of it, but the truth was undeniable. Megan, my wife, the woman I'd built my life with, was kissing someone else. And she didn't just look happy, she looked alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. I stumbled back, retreating toward the hallway that led to the restrooms. My chest burned with the sting of betrayal, like acid eating away at me. Her laughter still echoed in my ears, sharp and cruel against the backdrop of my spiraling thoughts. She was out there, enjoying herself with another man, while I stood there, invisible and crumbling. In the restroom, I gripped the edge of the sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide, filled with disbelief. The question hammered at me, what had happened to the woman I married? Where had the trust between us gone? How had we fallen this far? I forced myself to steady my breathing, my fingers digging into the countertop. The disbelief gave way to something harder, colder. I wasn't going to let this continue. Moments later, I straightened up, brushing off the weight pressing down on me, and stepped back into the restaurant. Each step I took carried a growing resolve. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but one thing was certain, I couldn't ignore what I had just seen. Not anymore. He couldn't keep up the charade anymore, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. With his pulse hammering in his chest, Luke strode back toward the dining area, each step heavier with determination. He hated that it had come to this. Confronting Megan here, in a restaurant, in front of strangers, felt humiliating. There would be no privacy, no dignity. But he couldn't walk away without answers. Not this time. As he approached the booth, Megan and the man sitting with her were still deep in conversation, unaware of his presence. Luke stopped a few feet away, just watching them for a moment. Anger and hurt coiled tightly in his chest, weighing him down like an anchor. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight and barely above a whisper. "Megan." At first, she didn't hear him. Swallowing hard, he tried again, louder this time, the sharpness of his tone cutting through the restaurant's quiet murmur. "Megan." Her head jerked up, her eyes locking onto his. Surprise flickered there, followed by something else, something that looked an awful lot like guilt before she quickly masked it with confusion. "Daniel?" she asked, her voice faltering. What are you doing here?" The man beside her, whose name Luke didn't even know, glanced up with irritation etched across his face. But Megan's attention was squarely on Luke now. She hesitated, as if scrambling for the right thing to say, but the words didn't come. The silence between them grew thick and suffocating, pushing Luke's anger closer to the surface. He wasn't going to let her twist the narrative. Not this time. "What the hell is this, Megan?" he demanded, his voice trembling with raw, unfiltered emotion. "What's going on here?" Her cheeks flushed, and she shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his gaze. The man beside her reached out, placing a hand on her arm as if to steady her. That was the last straw. Luke's anger flared white-hot. "This is between me and her," he snapped, his glare shifting to the man. "Stay out of it." For a brief moment, Megan's eyes flickered with something, regret, maybe, but Luke wasn't in the mood for guessing games. Before she could open her mouth, he cut her off. "I saw you," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. "I saw you two in the lobby. Laughing. Kissing. Celebrating your little 2-month anniversary, huh? Is this how you want it to end, Megan? With me standing here, watching you with him?" He pulled off his wedding ring and tossed it onto the table. The small piece of metal clinked against the surface, landing in front of her. Megan's face went pale, and her mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. The silence between them stretched painfully, filled with the weight of everything they hadn't said to each other in months. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and defensive. "Maybe you should leave," he muttered, clearly annoyed. "This isn't your business." Luke's cold stare fixed on him. "Oh, trust me," he said, his voice laced with venom. "It's my business." Megan found her voice at last, but it came out weak, trembling under the strain of the moment. "This isn't. It's not what it looks like," she stammered. Luke's laugh was short and bitter. "Save it, Megan," he said, his tone sharp and unyielding. "I'm done. I can't keep living this lie." Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked away. The restaurant door swung shut behind him with a finality that seemed to echo through his entire being. Outside, the cold night air hit him, stinging his skin, but it didn't even come close to numbing the pain tearing through his chest. He kept walking, never looking back. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he wandered aimlessly through the city streets. His mind was a tangled mess, replaying what he'd just witnessed. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the shock, the rage bubbling just beneath the surface. 2 months. The words echoed in his mind like a cruel mantra. Megan had been with this man for 2 months. While he'd been waiting at home, trusting her, hoping they could find their way back to the life they'd built, she'd been out there. Laughing. Kissing. Building something new with someone else. The realization slammed into him like a freight train, knocking the air from his lungs. Everything he thought he knew about their marriage, their life together, was gone. As the city lights blurred past him, Luke's emotions churned in a whirlwind of anger and sorrow. Beneath the seething rage was a deep, suffocating sadness, a kind of grief that clawed at his chest, threatening to consume him. For all the years they had shared, for all the love they had once built together, how had he missed the signs? How had he failed to see Megan slipping away? It wasn't until he reached the hotel that he finally stopped. He stood outside for a moment, the cold air biting at his skin, unsure of what he was even doing anymore. He had no plan, no sense of what to do next. But one thing was clear, he couldn't face her again. Not yet. He needed time to process it all, the shock, the grief, the anger, every emotion crashing over him in relentless waves. The buzz of conversation in the lobby barely registered as he walked inside. The receptionist offered him a polite smile, but he didn't even glance her way. He needed solitude, a moment of silence in the chaos swirling around him. The elevator ride felt interminable, each second dragging out as his mind spiraled deeper into the turmoil. When the doors finally opened, he stepped into his suite and shut the door behind him with a quiet finality. The hotel room, which had once seemed warm and inviting, now felt cold and alien. The walls seemed to close in as he stood motionless in the center, his thoughts racing uncontrollably. He threw his jacket onto the bed and began pacing, his hands raking through his hair as frustration and heartbreak collided within him. He needed someone to talk to, someone to unload this unbearable weight onto. But there was no one. No one who could truly understand what it felt like to stand in his shoes, a man broken by the person he had trusted the most. His thoughts kept circling back to the same image, Megan's face when he confronted her. The way her eyes widened in shock, her cheeks flushed, the way her expression shifted as she realized the facade was shattered and her lies laid bare. And then there was the kiss. That damn kiss. The way she kissed the other man, so easily, so naturally, with all the warmth and affection she once reserved for Luke. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a knife to the heart, twisting deeper with every thought. Anger surged again, white-hot and unrelenting, propelling him into a faster pace across the room. His thoughts spiraled further into the darkness until the sharp buzz of his phone snapped him out of it. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he wanted to see who was calling. But when the name appeared on the screen, his hand moved instinctively. Laura. His mother-in-law. He let it ring a moment longer, the vibration humming in his palm, before taking a deep breath and answering. Laura, he said, his voice tight and strained. Daniel, she began, her tone tentative, as if she was afraid of what she might hear. Hannah called me. She said you two had a fight. I need to know what's going on. Please, tell me. The words caught in his throat, and he swallowed hard before finally speaking. She's been having an affair, Laura, he said, the truth spilling out like a wound reopening. She's been seeing someone else for months. I saw them tonight. Together. They're celebrating their anniversary. A heavy silence followed. Luke could hear Laura's breath hitch on the other end, the weight of his words sinking in. His chest tightened as he waited for her response. No, Laura said at last, her voice trembling with disbelief. You must be mistaken. Hannah would never, she would never do that to you. Luke closed his eyes, steadying himself against the surge of emotions. I saw them, Laura, he said, his voice firmer now. I saw them kissing, holding hands, laughing together. They were celebrating their anniversary. She's been lying to me. All this time, I trusted her, and she's been with him. Another silence stretched between them, heavier now, filled with the weight of unspoken pain. When Laura finally spoke, her voice was quieter, subdued. Daniel, I don't know what to say. If what you're saying is true, if you really saw them, then I can't believe it. Luke felt his anger bubble to the surface again, but he forced himself to stay calm. He didn't want to lash out at Laura. She wasn't the one who had betrayed him. I've already made my decision, Laura, he said, his voice low but resolute. I'm done. It's over. The line crackled faintly as Laura took a shaky breath, trying to collect herself. So, what happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke paused, feeling the weight of the question settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. What did happen now? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. He didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. Megan had been his world, the love of his life, the woman he'd planned a future with. But that future had crumbled, irreparably shattered. There was no going back. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. "I'm going home. And I'm starting over. For my own sake." Laura's voice softened, her usual strength replaced with sadness. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I truly am." "Thanks," he whispered, the word barely audible. Without another word, he ended the call, the silence that followed feeling heavier than the conversation itself. The room felt colder, emptier now. Luke walked over to the window, staring out at the city's endless sprawl of lights. The city that never slept seemed oblivious to his world falling apart. He searched the skyline for answers, but all he had were the raw, jagged pieces of a life he no longer recognized. He needed to leave. To move on. Staying here, in this limbo of uncertainty, would only suffocate him further. He had to let go of everything, even if it meant walking away from the familiar. For the first time in years, Luke felt a faint glimmer of freedom. But it wasn't the kind of freedom he had imagined. It was cold, bitter, and unforgiving, a stark reminder of what he had lost. That night, standing at the window, he couldn't shake the feeling that his world had tilted off its axis. The weight of everything he had endured pressed down on him, suffocating and relentless. His thoughts drifted back to Megan, to their marriage, to the years of love and trust he had poured into someone who ultimately betrayed him in the most devastating way. He had thought he could handle this, that he could walk away with his dignity intact. But the raw, aching emptiness he felt now was nothing like he had prepared for. The reality of it all hit him harder than he ever expected. The next day was no better. He spent hours pacing the hotel hallways, trying to push back the tidal wave of sadness that kept threatening to drown him. He had planned to pack up and leave, to return home and start piecing his life back together. But something wouldn't let him. There was one final, unresolved thread he needed to confront. He had to face Laura. Megan's mother deserved to know the truth, at least his side of it. Maybe she wouldn't believe him. Maybe she would defend Megan, as she always had when her behavior came into question. But Luke needed to say it out loud. He needed closure, and this was the only way to get it. By noon, he was standing in front of Laura's house, the chill in the air mirroring the heaviness in his chest. He hesitated, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. Facing Megan was out of the question, he wasn't ready for that. But Laura? He couldn't avoid her, not after everything. The thought of her disappointment and disbelief weighed heavily on him, but he knew this had to be done. Before he could knock, the door opened. Laura stood there, looking older and more worn than he remembered. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I didn't think you'd come. After last night." "I had to," Luke replied, his voice tight with emotion. "I can't leave things like this, Laura. You deserve to know the truth." She stepped aside, wordlessly inviting him in. The familiar scent of old wood and lavender filled the house, bringing a rush of memories from family gatherings when he and Megan had first started dating. The warmth of the past only deepened the pain of the present. He followed Laura into the living room, his steps slow and deliberate. Each movement felt heavier, as though the air itself resisted him. He braced himself, knowing that the hardest part was still to come. Luke sank into the couch, the soft fabric doing little to ease the tension tightening his chest. Across from him, Laura remained standing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if bracing herself for the storm about to hit. Her face betrayed a mixture of confusion and concern, but there was something else lingering there too, something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. She hadn't spoken yet, but the weight of unspoken words hung in the air. "I saw them together, Laura," Luke said finally, his voice trembling but resolute. "I saw Megan and him, Chase, last night at a restaurant. They were celebrating their anniversary. Laura's expression faltered, her lips trembling as though she were grasping for a response that wouldn't come. "You're mistaken," she said softly, her tone almost pleading. "Hannah would never." "She couldn't." "No," Luke interrupted, his voice cutting through her denial, harsher than he intended. "I'm not mistaken. I saw them, Laura. Kissing. Holding hands. Celebrating like it was their damn honeymoon." Her eyes welled with tears, and she turned toward the window, wiping them away quickly. For a moment, Luke thought she might leave the room altogether, retreating from the weight of what he'd just told her. But instead, she lowered herself into the chair across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. "You have to understand, Daniel," she began, her voice small and uncertain. "Hannah, she's been under so much pressure at work. She's always been terrified of losing you. Maybe this isn't what it seems. Maybe it's just an emotional mistake." Luke's chest tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "An emotional mistake," he repeated, disbelief sharpening his words. He shook his head, incredulous. "You think that's all this is? How long has this been going on, Laura?" "I've been in the dark for months, and now," he stopped himself, swallowing hard as he fought to rein in his anger. He couldn't let it take over. "Not here. Not now." Laura sighed, her gaze distant, as though searching for an explanation that might make it all make sense. "I don't know what to believe," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I raised her, Daniel. She's my daughter. And as much as I want to believe she's been faithful to you, I can't ignore what you're saying. But I'm not ready to throw everything away. You too, you've been through so much together." Luke leaned back, his mind spinning. He hadn't expected Laura to accept the truth easily, but her reluctance stung all the same. It was as though her need to protect her daughter overshadowed everything else. He couldn't blame her for that, it was what mothers did, but it didn't make it hurt any less. "I'm not throwing anything away, Laura," he said, his tone softer now, laced with resignation. "I'm not giving up on her. She gave up on me. She lied to me. 4 months. I don't owe her loyalty after this. I can't do it anymore." Tears rolled down Laura's cheeks, and she wiped them away quickly, her voice trembling. "Daniel, please. I know this isn't easy. But Hannah's always been so scared of losing you. Maybe this is her way of coping. I don't know. But I do know that she loves you." Luke let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and cutting. "Love?" he repeated. "If she loved me, she wouldn't have done this. She wouldn't have lied to me for months. Love doesn't look like that, Laura." Laura met his gaze, her pain evident in her eyes. "What are you going to do now?" Luke stood, his resolve solidifying as he straightened. "I'm leaving," he said firmly. "I'm going back to Chicago. I'm moving on. I can't keep holding on to something that's not there anymore." Laura didn't try to stop him. She simply nodded, her eyes full of unsaid words. Turning toward the window, she stared out into the world beyond, her silhouette heavy with sadness. The silence between them was thick and oppressive, but Luke felt no urge to break it. He had said everything that needed to be said. As he left the house, the hours that followed blurred together in a haze of motion and confusion. He didn't return to the hotel. Instead, he wandered aimlessly through the streets of New York, unable to stop moving, unable to make sense of the chaos in his mind. He had cut ties with Laura, made it clear that he was done. But the weight of the decision didn't ease the sharp pangs of guilt stabbing at his chest. It didn't soften the ache of knowing Megan was no longer his. The city around him mirrored his mood, busy, chaotic, indifferent. People passed by, caught up in their own lives, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. And as the hours dragged on, Luke realized that while he had taken the first step toward moving on, the road ahead was going to be far lonelier than he ever imagined. Luke wasn't sure where his feet were taking him, he only knew he needed to get away, from everything, from everyone, from the memories that seemed to close in on him like a fog. The places and people that had once held so much meaning now felt hollow, tainted by betrayal. The life he had built with Megan, a life full of love, compromise, and hope, was gone, shattered in an instant. As he wandered past neon signs and the busy hum of the city streets, it hit him, he wasn't just walking to clear his head. He was walking away from it all. From the life he thought he knew. From the woman he thought he loved. Eventually, he found himself back at the hotel. The same hotel where, just a day ago, he had arrived filled with optimism, ready to surprise Megan and mend the fractures in their marriage. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. He had been so sure that he could fix things, that their love could survive anything. But that dream had died the moment he saw her with someone else. It was around 5 in the evening when a knock came at his door. Luke froze, his pulse quickening. It couldn't be Megan, not this soon. But the knock came again, louder and more insistent. Reluctantly, he opened the door, and there she was. Megan stood before him, looking smaller than he remembered. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes, puffy and red, held an expression that wavered between exhaustion and regret. Maybe even guilt. Her slumped posture seemed to mirror the weight of everything that had happened, as though it was finally catching up to her. Luke didn't move. He didn't invite her in. He didn't need to. He had already made his choice. "You came," he said flatly, his voice giving nothing away. "I had to," she replied, her voice quiet and hesitant. "We need to talk." The words hung heavy in the air, but Luke didn't know what there was left to say. What could she possibly say to undo the damage she had done? To explain the years of deceit, the lies, the affair. He had seen it all. He had felt the betrayal deep in his bones. There was no room left for excuses. "I'm not sure there's anything left to say, Megan," he said, his voice calm but resolute. I saw you and him at the restaurant, celebrating your little 2-month anniversary. It couldn't be clearer." Megan's eyes flickered with pain, but she didn't look away. She stood there for a long moment, as if trying to collect her thoughts, before taking a tentative step forward. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said, her voice trembling. "I wasn't thinking straight. Everything became so overwhelming. I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to fix us." Luke couldn't believe what he was hearing. She was still making excuses, still trying to frame this as something beyond her control. Her words stung, sounding rehearsed, like she'd been practicing them in front of a mirror, convincing herself that they might sound believable. "Overwhelming," he repeated, his voice rising. "You were overwhelmed. By what, Megan? By the guilt of lying to me? By the guilt of sneaking around behind my back? How many months did I live with a stranger in my own home? How many nights did you lie to me, kiss me goodnight, and then go kiss him? How many?" Megan flinched at his words, the anger laced in them like a sharp blade. But she didn't back down. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice breaking into a desperate plea. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Luke. I swear, I didn't. It just happened." "Just happened," Luke scoffed, shaking his head. "No, Megan. 2 months of sneaking around and lying to me didn't just happen. That took effort. That took planning. You've been seeing him for weeks, and you thought I wouldn't notice? You thought I wouldn't figure it out?" Megan's face crumpled, and for the first time, Luke thought he saw real remorse. Tears spilled down her cheeks, her voice cracking as she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't think I'd lose control like this." Luke's stomach churned at the raw sincerity in her voice, but it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. Not after what she had done. You've lost control, all right, he said bitterly, his voice low and cutting. You've lost everything. And you don't even seem to care. Because if you did, Megan, you would have come to me. You would have told me the truth. But you didn't. You chose him. Her silence said more than any words could. For a moment, Luke thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, shame, regret, maybe even love, but it didn't matter. Not anymore. Whatever they had, whatever they once shared, was gone. And no amount of apologies or explanations could bring it back. You chose the affair, Luke said, his tone sharp but controlled. And now you're standing here, telling me it was all a mistake. I don't buy it. Megan's expression crumbled as the weight of his words hit her. She opened her mouth, her voice cracking with emotion. I don't know what to do anymore, she admitted, her words trembling. I thought I could fix it, but I didn't know how. I still don't. You can't fix it, Luke replied, his voice softer now but unyielding. It's broken, Megan. And I'm not going to pretend it's not. I can't be the one to put it back together. Not anymore. You made your choice. And I've made mine. The finality in his voice silenced any lingering hope. Megan stood there, hands trembling at her sides, her lips pressed tightly together as if searching for words that wouldn't come. There was nothing left to say, nothing that could undo what had been done. Luke took a step back, exhaustion washing over him. I think it's time for you to leave, he said quietly, the pain evident in his tone. I've said all I need to say. I've made my choice. Megan's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply nodded, turned, and walked out of the room without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence that followed was deafening. Luke stood frozen, his heart a storm of conflicting emotions. Anger, sorrow, relief, it all swirled inside him, but one truth remained, it was over. This chapter of his life had ended, and there was no going back. For the first time, he felt the weight of that realization settle over him like a heavy blanket. He moved to the window, staring out at the city below. The hotel room, once filled with warmth and the promise of reconciliation, now felt colder than ever. Memories of their life together lingered in the air, ghosts of what could have been, but Luke forced himself to push them away. The urge to chase after Megan, to ask her to stay, tugged at him. But he knew better. That part of him, the part that clung to hope, was gone. The choice had been made. Turning away from the window, Luke blinked against the exhaustion pulling at his eyelids. The adrenaline from the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a hollow ache in its wake. He felt drained, as if the life had been sapped out of him. And yet, there was a strange sense of finality, too. He didn't need to hold on anymore. Not to the memories, not to the pain. The shrill ring of his phone broke through the quiet. The number was unfamiliar, but something told him to answer. Hesitating for a moment, he let it ring a few more times before picking up. Hello, he said, his voice rough with fatigue. A familiar voice came through the line, soft and hesitant. Daniel? It's me. Megan's mom. Luke closed his eyes, the tightness in his chest returning. He had been expecting this. Laura, holding on to some shred of hope that there was an explanation for all of this, that Megan wasn't entirely at fault. But Luke had no patience left to explain. He was done with all of it. Laura, he said simply, his voice flat. There was a pause, and then Laura's voice returned, thick with emotion. She called me. Told me what happened. I don't know what to say. I don't want to believe she'd do this, Daniel. To you. To both of you. I don't understand how this could happen. Luke gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. He wanted to lash out, to tell Laura that her daughter had made this mess, that she didn't deserve excuses or justifications. But the sharp edges of his anger had dulled, worn down by the endless disappointment of the last few days. She made her choice, he said finally, his voice calm but firm. I'm done fighting for something that's not there anymore. I've been holding on to something that was gone a long time ago. It's time for me to move on. A heavy silence hung over the line as Laura processed his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, resigned. I understand. I wish things hadn't turned out this way. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I truly am. Luke's eyes closed, her apology washing over him like a wave he didn't want to feel. Sympathy wasn't what he needed. Not now. Not from her. Take care, Laura, he said, his voice steady but distant. Without waiting for her reply, he ended the call, the silence in the room returning like an old companion. Luke didn't need anyone's sympathy. He didn't need apologies or second chances. What he needed was for it all to end, for the pain, the anger, the lingering doubts, and questions to finally stop. It's not your fault, Laura, he said after a long pause. But I have to do this. I have to let her go. And I have to let go of the life we built together. I know, Laura said softly, her voice heavy with understanding. But please, don't close the door completely. She's still your family. She's still the woman you loved. A bitter laugh escaped Luke's lips, sharp and humorless. Family? The woman I loved? He shook his head, the weight of his words bearing down on him. She's a stranger to me now. She chose him over me. And you know what? I don't think I can ever look at her the same way again. Laura didn't respond, and in that moment of silence, Luke realized something. He wasn't angry anymore. The fire that had burned so brightly within him for days was gone, leaving only a hollow exhaustion in its place. He wasn't furious. He was tired. Bone deep, soul-crushingly tired. And he had nothing left to say. Well, Laura said finally, her tone resigned and thick with sorrow. If you ever change your mind, you know where we are. Luke hesitated, his grip tightening on the phone. Then he nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Thank you, Laura. But this is my choice. And it's the right one. Without waiting for her reply, he ended the call. The silence in the room returned, but it didn't feel as oppressive this time. For the first time in what felt like forever, Luke took a deep breath and felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. He was done. Done with the lies, the deceit, the endless emotional tug-of-war. Most importantly, he was done waiting for someone who had already moved on. The love he had for Megan still existed, buried deep inside. But it wasn't enough. Love wasn't enough to stay in a toxic, broken relationship. The moment he'd seen her with James, laughing, touching, kissing, that had been the moment he knew it was over. It was time to walk away. The next few hours passed in a blur. Luke packed quickly and methodically, grabbing only the essentials, a few shirts, a jacket, his laptop. He wasn't in the mood for sentimentality. He didn't have the energy for it. But as he was about to zip up his suitcase, his eyes fell on the photo of him and Megan, taken on their honeymoon. It had always been his favorite. They looked so happy, so carefree back then. But not anymore. Not now. He slid the photo into his bag without another glance, unwilling to linger on what was already gone. When he was done, he stood in the doorway of the hotel room, his bag slung over his shoulder. He took one last look around the space. It didn't feel like home. It hadn't felt like home for a long time. Without hesitation, he stepped out and closed the door behind him, not bothering to look back. The cold air hit him as he emerged onto the busy streets of New York, the city alive with its usual chaos. People rushed past him, their lives continuing as if nothing had changed. But for Luke, everything had stopped. His world had been ripped apart, and now, all he could do was leave it behind. The drive to the airport was long, though it felt even longer with the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He leaned back in the taxi's seat, his eyes fixed on the distant skyline as it blurred past. There were no tears left to cry. He had spent them all in the days leading up to this. The anger that had fueled him was gone now, replaced by a heavy emptiness. A strange, hollow finality lingered in his chest, a mix of sorrow and relief. Yet, as the taxi sped toward the airport, uncertainty gnawed at him. What came next? How do you rebuild when the life you thought you'd have is gone? Could he even find himself again after this? His mind wandered back to the call with Laura. Her voice, heavy with regret and maternal pain, echoed in his head. He understood why she had struggled to accept the truth. Megan was her daughter, her flesh and blood. No parent wants to believe their child is capable of betrayal. But her reluctance to face reality had made things harder, reopening wounds that Luke was desperate to close. As the airport loomed in the distance, Luke exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the window. He didn't know where he was going yet. All he knew was that he couldn't stay. He couldn't keep living in the wreckage of what once was. It was time to move forward, one step at a time, even if the path ahead felt uncertain. She still clung to the faint hope that Megan might find a way to fix everything, that somehow the pieces could be put back together. But Luke knew better. There was no going back. The damage was done, and no amount of wishing could undo it. The airport was bustling with its usual energy, the blend of excitement, stress, and goodbyes that marked every terminal. Luke moved through security quickly, the chaos around him feeling distant, almost unreal. It was as if he were watching it all unfold from the outside, detached from his own life. Sitting in the departure lounge, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through the messages he'd ignored over the past few days. Concerned texts from his parents, check-ins from friends, and one final voicemail from Megan. He stared at her name on the screen for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the play button. But he couldn't bring himself to listen to it. Hearing her voice, her desperation, would only make it harder to keep moving forward. He had already given her too many chances, and each time, she had chosen someone else. Now, there was nothing left to salvage. The gate number flashed on the screen, signaling the start of boarding. Luke stood, grabbed his bag, and made his way to the line. As he walked, his mind drifted back to their last conversation, those final moments with Megan. The emptiness in her eyes. The sadness in her voice. It had felt so surreal, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. When he'd asked her, almost pleadingly, if this was truly how she wanted it to end, her sadness had been palpable. But even that wasn't enough. Nothing was enough to undo the damage. The flight was long, and Luke spent most of it staring out the window. The city lights below blurred into an endless expanse of darkness, mirroring the thoughts racing through his mind. He replayed the events of the past few days, searching for answers he knew he wouldn't find. What could he have done differently? What had gone so wrong? But every time, he came back to the same truth: Megan had made her choice. And now, he had made his. When the plane touched down in Chicago, the familiar sights of home did little to ease the ache in his chest. He had thought that leaving, putting miles between himself and the wreckage of his marriage, would bring relief. But the emptiness followed him, clinging to him like a shadow. Walking into his house, Luke set his bag down and looked around. The space felt different now, cold, hollow. It no longer felt like a home. Instead, it felt like a shell of what it had once been, filled with memories that had lost their warmth. Every corner seemed to echo with the ghosts of what he had lost. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. A new text from Megan appeared on the screen. "I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. I hope one day you can forgive me." Luke stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the screen. Part of him wanted to respond, to let out the anger and heartbreak still churning inside him. He wanted to tell her how deeply she had hurt him, how thoroughly she had destroyed what they had built together. But he knew better. No message, no apology, could change the reality of what had happened. The finality of it all was too much to undo. Setting the phone down, he walked to the kitchen. The sound of ice clinking into a glass as he prepared a drink was oddly comforting, a small, steady rhythm in an otherwise chaotic world. He poured himself a measure of whiskey, the weight of the glass grounding him in the present moment. It felt solid. Real. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't have a roadmap for rebuilding his life after the destruction. But as he took a sip of his drink, he let out a long, slow breath. For the first time in a long while, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. Not for the past or for what he had lost, but for the possibility of something new. This was the beginning of a new chapter. One that didn't involve Megan. One that was entirely his own. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But he would move forward, step by step. He had been broken, yes. But he wasn't finished. And for now, that was enough.